Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining in. I'm here to introduce Freddy Nguyen, one of our postdoctoral fellow awardees from a few years ago, and we're excited to just have a chat with Freddy about his career, how he chose science, what it looks like, and where he is, where he hopes to be going. So, Freddy, I'd like to turn it over to you, and if you could just give us a quick update on sort of where you are and then go back to the beginning and talk about what got you first interested perhaps in science and research.
Well, first of all, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this new podcast. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So currently I'm a research fellow at MIT. I'm also a medical resident at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. So yes, I lead the crazy life of splitting my time between two institutions and two cities, but somehow I managed to make it all work. In terms of, I think, when I first got my science bug, so to speak, I did my undergrad at Rice University. When I first started, was definitely had wanted to do chemistry and math as my majors, and was gonna head into the pre-med pathway. And then as part of my chemistry degree, we had to do a research thesis as part of that. And so it wasn't until my junior year in college that I started doing research and really started exploring in different labs, both at Rice and then ultimately also at Baylor College of Medicine, and also back at University of Arkansas when I went home for the summer. But one, I would say the research experience that I had at Rice, and I worked in a couple labs. The one lab that was most memorable to me, and is really, I think, what sparked my interest in science, was working with Bob Curl, who was won the Nobel Prize in '96 in chemistry for the Buckminster fluorine, and really, was one of the three individuals who helped start the nanotechnology field back then. But really, what attracted me the most was the fact that despite all of his accolades and despite his stature, he was very much down to earth individual, really cared about mentoring undergraduates in his lab. And to me, that's really what science was about, is that it really became about the science and the creation of new knowledge. And as long as you bring good ideas and thoughts to the table, you were an equal member of that team. And I think, to me, that was also the fun part, is not only being seen as part of the team, but also being able to contribute knowledge back into the field as well. But ultimately, I think the mentoring aspect was really what kept me on the track. And I've had obviously many research experiences over the years, and some better than most. And but every time I go back to that experience, because Bob to this day is still one of my career mentors, even now. And this is now like 20 plus years later. Yeah. Anytime I'm back in Houston, I still meet up with him. We have lunch and catch up, and he's been there through every major step of the way. And I think that's really what is needed in not only drawing people into the sciences, but also keeping them in the sciences as well.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's great to hear. So you kind of mentioned you were pre-med. Do you think that research experience tilted you off that scale, or since you're an MD PhD, how do you sort of balance that? Were you still pre-med?
Very good question. So I did obviously go to medical school, and I'm now doing my residency. So I'm still trying to do both. And I will say that my attraction to either the medicine side, the med school side, versus the the pure research route, I've gone back and forth very much along throughout the pathway. So after my undergrad, I took a gap year and worked in a lab at MIT, really to figure out, was research really something I wanted to do? Was science something I really wanted to do? I know that I was going to go to medical school, so that wasn't a question mark at that point. And that's how I came then across, well, one, to do the experience at MIT, to both, really make sure that's really something I wanted to do, but then also, I think that's when I dug deeper and found out more about MD PhD programs, and so then applied to that. So So I did that at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, actually at the Beckman Institute there. And once I finished my MD PhD training, I really, so our program does the entire PhD first and then the MD second, unlike most other programs. And so by the time I finished medical school, I really missed the science part. I really missed that creative process, that investigative process, the autonomy about deciding not only what questions to ask, but also what new knowledge you can discover as well. So then I decided to go to MIT and go straight down the research pathway and do my postdoctoral research fellowship there. And then once I was there, I worked with Michael Strano as my advisor, and realized that every time he looked at me at a subgroup meeting or whatnot, I was the full source of all the biomedical knowledge and and so I very quickly knew how much I did know in clinical medicine and how much I still didn't know about clinical medicine. And so knowing about the clinical disease itself is really useful for development of research, but it's not the only component that's important, right? So the more practical aspects of the practice of medicine and patient care and so on is equally important in developing solutions that will ultimately be implemented and have an impact on patients. And so I think, and that was the reason for me to decide to also go back to doing my clinical residency as well, to get further training and then get a better understanding of not just the disease, but also how are different technologies currently being used in medicine, and how are clinicians thinking about the workflow, and how other parts of the medical entity or the hospital involved in that process as well.
This is actually fascinating, because it seems like you've gone back and forth, pre-med into research, PhD, medical school, then research postdoc, now residency. Do you think has that been a good idea? Would you recommend that, or?
So it's certainly been a very windy pathway to getting to where I am now. I mean, I guess my advice is if you know where you want to be at the end of it, obviously pick the straightest line to get there. But even thinking about this as even doing an MD PhD or trying to do both, what I tell most students is you can probably plan for like the next 3 to 5 years of your life, but you can't plan for 10 years out or 15 years out, which is what some of these training pathways end up being. And so all you can do is make the best decisions based on what you know at that point in time. And you may have other experiences along the way that changes your perspective and what you like or what you don't like, because you as an individual will also grow in that process. But the other thing is there may be other opportunities that come along downstream as well, and you may have other things that pull you in different directions as well. So so my advice is definitely plan for the next, you kind of have your plan for the 3 to 5 year timeline, but and have kind of a North Star for the longer than that, but don't get it down so detailed that you're tunnel visioned for the next 10, 15 years to get there. So for me, I kept going back and forth because I had different experiences along the way that pushed me towards one way and then pushed me back towards the other way. So.
Have your research projects and programs been related to your interest in clinical work? Has there really been a good synergy there? Or in your clinical side, are you thinking about some, one type of disease and researching on a different?
So as much as possible, I try to, because otherwise it becomes very challenging to maintain essentially the equivalence of two very separate careers or lives. So most of my scientific career has been around the oncology space. And so all the way through, I would say, medical school and through my postdoc, that was a very high focus, was using either the optical imaging techniques that I was developing or nanoscale sensors I was developing, really all geared towards oncological applications. And then when it came down to deciding which medical residency to do, I could have gone down the route of internal medicine and become a hematologist oncologist, and gone that route. But because so much of my work has been technology driven, in terms of technology and instrumentation development, pathology was a more natural fit because a lot of the diagnostic assays and a lot of the, especially cellular level or molecular level type of information, really is done through the pathology department. Even if you think about some of the point of care diagnostics and devices, that's all under the pathology department. And so that was really important for me because one, it was trying to think about, if I did develop some of these technologies, which clinical specialty was going to quote unquote own that technology once we pushed it into clinical medicine, right? So it was important to have a community of physicians that understood that and understood the type of information that was coming out of that new technology. So I think that was one really important aspect of, so when I was doing my postdoc with Michael Strano, I was also working with Gary Tierney over at Mass General Hospital. He's also he's an MD PhD and trained in pathology, but he sits within the leadership of the College of American Pathologists to help provide the guidance and the guidelines for the subspecialty to provide guidance on the use of these new technologies. And so I think that's an important aspect that, again, if I'd only done medical school, I would have only been exposed to, okay, what are the diseases and how do the diseases work, but not kind of this component of it in terms of, you could call it the more regulatory aspect or the more practical aspect of technology adoption in medicine.
Very cool. So thinking about that 3 to 5 year time frame, where do you see this going? How do you see your clinical residency wrapping up and sort of the next phase?
Yeah, so I'm actually currently in my last and final year of residency, so I have about 4 more months to go. And then I'm going to be doing a 1-year clinical fellowship at Dartmouth in transfusion medicine. And then after that, ideally would be transitioning into an academic faculty position, and hopefully, finding a split between both, I would say largely research lab, and then probably hopefully a 20% or so component that's still clinical responsibilities, and then really also hope to figure out how to fit in sort of my other interests in the innovation and entrepreneurship space, and trying to think about how some of the technologies that I work on might ultimately be spun out into companies or startups downstream as well. So
the research scientist, practicing clinician, and CEO. Sounds doable. That's amazing. Just looking back along that path, what resources did you really have to reach out and find or rely on to kind of help you along each step? What kind of advice would you give someone looking at a similar career projection and kind of wondering where to get started? One thing that sticks out to me is you said you got a year off and went to MIT, and I'm just wondering, how did you find that opportunity? Maybe that's one key thing that happened and got you kind of sparked on this path.
I would say a couple of things. I mean, so one is I was very lucky to have very good mentors and a lot of different mentors along my pathway. And so when I finished my or as I was finishing up my undergrad, again, I was still kind of going back and forth. Do I just do straight medical school, or do I really want to do research or not? And as I started talking to the people I work with in my own lab at that point, they said, well, why don't you take a year and try to figure that out, right? Because at least you're just spending a year and not spending 5 years doing a PhD that you don't want to do, right? So in terms of how I ended up getting into that lab, it was going to the professors I talked to that I either bonded well and were my mentors at Rice, and then they connected me to the people they knew and the different labs that they had, and so they had access to. And so a lot of them ended up being in Boston that I looked at, whether it was at Harvard or MIT, and then was able to get into this particular lab to further explore for a year, which, I think at the end of the day, I always tell people, you never know who is connected to who. It's a very small world in science. It's a very small world in medicine. And so, I think as much as people like to say that networking maybe is a bad word, but I see it as really an opportunity to explore and to get to know other people. And so, I think that's an underappreciated aspect. So to more succinctly answer your question, I would say, I really relied on having good mentors around me, and not just having a single mentor, but having multiple mentors, because they all provided different perspectives. And mentors don't always have to be kind of this very hierarchical top-down thing. I mean, I think mentors can be people who may just be one step ahead of you in terms of, if you're an undergrad and it's a grad student, or if you're a grad student, it's a postdoc. It doesn't necessarily always have to be a professor that can help guide you in that process. And because I had so many different interests, I needed mentors along the way that were on the science side, were on the clinical side, were on the entrepreneurship side, were on the mix of, a couple of those things at any point in time. And I think that's been super helpful, because at the end of the day, the path that you'll carve for yourself is your path. And so I think it's about making that unique path that works for you, not necessarily just adapting somebody else's path. I like to say, I like to sort of pick the best parts of the other people's career paths and trying to adapt it to mine. But yeah, ultimately, I would say the mentors for sure.
That's great. Any other tidbits of advice you'd like to pass along for anyone thinking about a MD, PhD in particular?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Oh, sorry. Any other piece of advice, final parting thoughts for people considering that MD, PhD path that you would pass along?
I don't know if it's necessarily specific to the MD, PhD path. I would say follow your passion, explore your passion and any interests you may have. I'm personally a very experiential person, so unless I directly take on that experience and dive head deep into it, it's really hard for me to make that decision of, is this something I really want to do versus something that I don't really want to do. So I think any opportunities that you can find to explore your passions and really make sure that it is the passion you want to pursue, certainly do so. And then, I think if you have that passion, everything else, I think, will fall in line with that. So.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and good luck with all of your multiple careers that you're pursuing all at the same time.
Well, thanks, Anne. Again, really enjoyed doing this podcast, and hopefully looking forward to seeing some of the others that you'll have on as well.
Great. Thank you so much.